It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan. David Feldman is out today, but it wouldn't be a show without a Feldman, so we have Hannah Feldman as my co-host. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Steve.
And of course, it really wouldn't be a show without the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
On today's show, we're going to ask the question, is it possible for a corporation to be socially responsible and still compete in the marketplace? Our first guest, Toby Heaps, would say yes. In fact, he would actually go further and argue that companies with sustainable environmental policies actually perform better than their short-sighted competitors. Mr. Heaps is co-founder and CEO of Corporate Knights, and Knights is spelled Knights, as in what you'd find sitting at a round table. Corporate Knights is a leading sustainable economy media and research company based in Canada, and Mr. Heaps is editor-in-chief of Corporate Knights magazine. The research team at Corporate Knights develops global sustainability rankings, research reports, and financial product ratings based on corporate sustainability performance. Every year, they rank the 50 best corporate citizens. Corporate Knights maintains an editorial focus on climate change, responsible investing, and the ideas, actions, and innovations that shape a sustainable economy. We look forward to speaking with Mr. Heaps and highlighting some good corporate citizens. Then we welcome back Dr. Bandy Lee. Dr. Lee is the psychiatrist who first sounded the alarm about former President Donald Trump's malignant narcissism. She was the editor of The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, 37 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president. Now, despite 2 impeachments and 4 criminal indictments, Donald Trump is far and away leading the polls to again become the Republican Party's nominee for president. Is Donald Trump just another candidate, or should the media be covering Trump differently? As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our indefatigable corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, we spend a lot of time on this program talking about corporate bad boys. Let's hear about what it takes to be a good guy. Hannah?
Toby Heaps is the CEO and co-founder of Corporate Knights and editor-in-chief of Corporate Knights magazine. He spearheaded the first global ranking of the world's 100 most sustainable corporations in 2005, and in 2007 coined the term clean capitalism. Toby has been published in the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Globe and Mail, and is a regular guest speaker on CBC. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Toby Heaps.
Thanks, Hannah.
And I want to add to Hannah's introduction, Toby, that this is all Canadian. You are Canadian. This is a Canadian publication that has a worldwide impact. It's a 65-page magazine, beautifully designed and full of graphics, clearly written, very little jargon, and it defines clean capitalism this way, quote, an economic system in which prices incorporate social, economic, and ecological benefits and costs, and people know the full impacts of their marketplace actions, end quote, which is a pretty high standard. And 4 times a year, the magazine is an insert in the Wall Street Journal, Toronto's Globe and Mail newspaper, and the Washington Post. So people, when they get the print edition, they get this magazine inside the newspaper. How's that worked out?
It's been nice. It's sort of wrapped in a nice bow with trust. People trust the Washington Post mostly. A lot of people trust the Wall Street Journal. A lot of people trust the Globe and Mail. And there's various bars you have to go in. I believe we're the only third-party sort of publication that is carried in the Washington Post. So that says something. It took a little while to get in there. And it's a nice way to be able to reach mainstream decision makers who are really trying to target. I think most people don't wake up in the morning thinking how they can screw up the world. Most people want to leave the world a little bit better than they found it. And a lot of people are lacking information on what to do, and they're lacking feedback loops with rewards for doing the right thing sometimes. And also just lacking awareness about other parts of the network they can connect into, other parts of the movement, which is a pretty significant full-blown movement now. And speaking of the sort of clean energy economy movement, the fossil fuel divestment movement coming from the other side as well. And it's been kind of interesting that the hypothesis we had at the beginning was to Anne Frank's wisdom in the Second World War when she was holed up in the attic in Amsterdam. She wrote that in spite of everything, she believed that people are really good at heart And I still believe that's true. And I think I used to be optimistic in spite of reality in many instances. And increasingly I'm optimistic because of realities. I see so many good things speeding up.
We have a lot of skeptical listeners, and when they hear about making corporations responsible, other than tough regulatory enforcement, prosecution, breaking up quasi-monopolies, they're very skeptical. But you reverberate off of something that the famous corporate guru Peter Drucker once said. He said, what gets measured gets managed. And that's sort of the mantra of Corporate Knights, your magazine. When I heard that, I recalled that before the Department of Labor was created in Washington, D.C., early in the 20th century, there was very little organized data about workers. And when the Department of Labor was established, one of the first things it did was it started collecting information about unemployment, about poverty, about worker injuries. And the moment the data was assembled, there was more publicity. Congress took note. Legislation was passed. Regulations were issued. Far less than what I would have wanted, but it all started from these measurements, and that's what your magazine is famous for. Can you tell us about your 100 best this and 100 best that, and how you make it concrete? And then by putting out best practices, you put pressure on the laggard corporations. You give people a chance to reject the laggard corporation when they make purchases and reward the better ones, and other similar feedback. Can you elaborate on all that? How'd you come to the yardsticks, which aren't easy, for determining the 100 best, and give us the description of the various 100 best?
Sure. So it's a good question. How does one come up with a list of the 100 best corporate citizens, 100 most sustainable corporations in the world? And we've refined an approach over 20 years, and our intent has always been pure. We're not looking for companies that are making the most money. We're looking for companies that are making the most positive impact on society, the social impact, and on the environment. So those are the only two things that we're considering. And we're not looking for fluff, and we're not looking for things that are easy to game. We're not looking for policies that are maybe good management tools. We're looking for material things that you can measure that matter. And so we put half the emphasis in our 25 indicator system, which can be downloaded, Global 100 Corporate Knights methodology, comes right up. Half of the emphasis in terms of weight is put on the company's operations. Half of the emphasis is put on how the company makes its money, in terms of is it making its money from products and services that have a clear demarcated benefit for the environment or for society: affordable housing, electric cars, green energy, sustainable plant proteins. And then we're looking at also, how does the company invest its money? So we're looking at the money side as half of the weight. How does it make its money? How does it invest its money? What percentage of its capital expenditures, research, development, and acquisitions is going into sustainable products and services is defined by us, which has been a great sort of piece of work that we've been engaged in with many others around the world, 350 organizations, to come up with an integrated new language that defines what is green, what is sustainable, and what is not at an industry by industry level. So we have the indicators on how does the company behave. We kick out a bunch of companies that have dark red flag behaviors, companies involved in cluster bombs, companies involved in deep deforestation, companies involved in for-profit prisons. That takes out about 10% of the universe when we take out all the sort of dark red flags. We then look at their operations. So we're looking at what percentage of their cash tax is expressed as a ratio of their profits, and how does that relate to their peers. We downgrade the companies that are not paying their taxes because that's the price we pay for civilization. We look at the diversity of their board and their executives, gender and racial. We look at the safety records, injuries, fatalities. We look at their pollution, carbon. We look at their energy use, their water use. We look at their toxic emissions, and we have industry-specific weights that go to every industry to account for the fact that how much water a bank uses doesn't really matter, but it does matter with a cement company or a nuclear power company. And then we put the emphasis with the weights where the material impacts of that industry are. And then for each company, we score it on each indicator relative to its industry peers, and then we weight it according to its industry. That gets us a score. And in doing that, we're able to come up with, out of a list of almost 7,000 companies globally, all the publicly traded companies with the market, with revenues of over $1 billion US, we're able to come up with the 100 most sustainable companies in the world. So we've been doing this since 2005. We launch it each year, coincident with the World Economic Forum in Davos, and we've been tracking it as a financial index with a third-party calculation agent, Solactive, based out of Frankfurt. And I was curious from the get-go, if we figure out who the 100 most sustainable companies are in the world, on a sector sort of neutral basis. So we have a similar exposure to what the investment benchmark would have in terms of its sector exposure. Would it outperform financially over time? Because we have an imperfect economy with policies that still slant the playing field, subsidies that still slant the playing field towards the dirty and the monopolistic and the corrupt economy in many respects. And so I wasn't sure, I hoped that would be the case, but I wasn't sure it would be the case. And it's been really interesting over almost 19 years of live performance. We've seen that the most sustainable companies outlive the less sustainable companies, the average company, by a factor of 2 to 1, and they outperform them on an annualized basis by over 1% per year, which over a course of almost 19 years is quite substantial in the investment world. And so it's been really, I guess, gratifying and inspiring to see that even in the imperfect system that we operate in, the companies that are doing better on taxes, doing better on sustainable products and services, those companies can not only deliver more value for us as people and for the planet, but they can also outperform. It's not always a win-win wonderland, but it's been really interesting to see that trend take hold. And that trend has widened where the most sustainable companies over the past 3 years are now significantly outperforming the average company. And I think that's because we're seeing the sustainable economy, whether it's electric cars, renewable power, plant protein, smart and green buildings, these sectors are becoming multi-$100 billion sectors, and they're really driving the biggest piece of the pie of economic growth. And the companies that are catalyzing on that and also showing a balanced way of doing business are thriving. None of these companies are angels. You know, some of them are steel recyclers, like Schnitzer Steel, which recently changed its name had some issues in Oakland and got sued, I think, by the Oakland A's for some pollution from its recycled steel plant. But they are making 100% recycled steel with renewable power. Do have almost half the directors that are women, are paying their taxes, and have dramatically reduced their waste and their pollution, and are doing really, really well economically too. And then you have companies like Ørsted out of Denmark, which a decade or so ago was one of the dirtiest companies in Europe, huge coal pollution. They made a decision at their board level to do a radical U-turn and then go all in investing in offshore wind turbines. And they thought it would take 30 years to do the transition. It took about 6 years to get most of it done, transform their business, increase their value by a factor of 4 when their peers were flat, and became the largest offshore wind producer in the world. And you see these stories happening all over the world, whether it's from the oil companies or the electric power companies, fossil power companies, or food companies or real estate companies. And the ones who are going all in, investing big in the green economy, in the more sustainable economy, are more often than not the ones who are hitting the biggest numbers financially.
Well, you have in your recent issue an article on page 46, which is titled Best 50 Corporate Citizens in Canada. And I have 3 questions on that. What do you do if you have a very good corporate citizen, but it's a very small company, say with $1 million sales? Do you have a cutoff? And second, give us the names of some of the top companies. And then third, have you ever thought of a reverse disincentive where you say the worst 50 corporate companies in Canada or around the world?
So when we look at companies for the most sustainable companies or best 50, we're looking generally at companies, large companies, so over $1 billion in revenue. We do have something now called the Future 50, which we started in Canada, and we're looking for companies who have the highest green sustainable companies who make the majority of their money from green or sustainable products and have had the biggest growth in terms of their revenue or capital raised over the last 2 rounds. So that includes many companies of less than $1 million or not much more than $1 million of revenue. But our rankings are mostly focused on the large companies. It's a resource question. It's quite an exercise. It takes about 10,000 hours a year to do the ranking of the 100 most sustainable companies, and that's a pool of just under 7,000. But we do recognize that the small, medium size companies are really important. In many ways, those are the ones that are pioneering the standards, and that's why we've come up with the Future 50, and we're looking to expand that. In terms of some of the leading names, Schneider Electric is a really cool company. They do industrial machinery out of Europe, based in France, not a household name necessarily, but they made a decision to become the sort of sustainable solution provider to all the major industries, whether it's cement or steel or oil and gas, people who use this big machinery. And their goal is to electrify and decarbonize everything. And they've had tremendous growth, really inspiring sort of old economy kind of company. It's not a .com kind of thing, but really inspiring to see that. Now you have companies like Neste Oil, which is now called Neste, based out of Finland, with a major sort of Northern European refiner of fossil fuel oil. And then about a decade ago, they made a decision to make a major investment in sustainable aviation fuels. They saw where the market was going, and their market value has appreciated more than almost any other company of its size or bigger in the oil and gas sector. They now make the majority of their money on sustainable aviation fuels that come from waste residue and waste products like cooking oil from McDonald's kind of thing. And they're investing the vast majority, 85% of their capital expenditure each year in growing those businesses. So it shows how a fossil fuel company can, in a relatively short period of time, completely change its business model and prosper economically, which is pretty interesting. When you go down the Global 100 list, you can Google Global 100 sustainable companies. There's stories like this all along the way. It's, there's Avita Soy, which is a Hong Kong-based company, a smaller company, billion-dollar company, but smaller compared to some of these other companies. And they're plowing in and making huge investments in plant protein and converting the animal milk products to plant protein with huge presence in China, where it really counts. It's interesting. China is one of the only countries out of major countries that have made the diet a part of their climate strategy, recognizing that they need to convert their animal-based diet, substantial portions of it, to plant-based because it's more efficient and much, much lower carbon. So that's a company that's kind of capitalizing on that trend. There's companies like McCormick, which owns Frank's Hot Sauce and probably have their spices in your spice cabinet based not that far from DC in Maryland. And they made a business model where they set up cooperatives they have growers of spices all around the world, from Nigeria to Sri Lanka to Madagascar. And they go in there and they set up cooperatives with the farmers so they can sell directly to the company and not have to go through 3 or 4 middlemen and get a pittance of the actual value of the spices they're harvesting, whether it's vanilla or cinnamon or pepper. And it's been really great for their business model, more resilient supply chain because their workers are making more money. Doesn't necessarily cost the company more, it's just a smart way of doing things. They work a lot with USAID and other entities getting these things set up. And they make great spices. They're not focused on salt. Things that really enliven foods and bring them together. And so it's good for people. And they figured out a neat business model where it's kind of win-win, where the workers can get way more benefits.
And what about doing it reverse, the worst 50?
Yeah. So that's kind of fun. I like to play on both sides. And so I'd say we kind of take about a 80% focus on positive. People sort of see us as the solutions folks, but I think it's important to keep people honest as well. And so from time to time, we'll do a deep dive. But when we do a deep dive, I really like to hit hard and get results because we're putting our name out there. So example, recently we did a deep dive into the tax avoidance of the big banks in Canada, which was off the scale. It was without shame. And in running into the billions and billions and billions of dollars per year. And we exposed it in excruciating detail with forensic accountants. We received threats when we were preparing the article over 6 months. We partnered with a major publication, the Toronto Star, for some legal cover as well. So it was a co-production. And then we published it, and the government, as it doesn't usually do everything it needs to do, but it closed down about $2 billion of annual loopholes. So it's been a bit of a tally for the banks. We've noticed our advertising revenue took a bit of a hit in that sector, which is fine. That's lots of sectors out there. We've done rankings like the Toxic 50, where we look at the 50 most toxic companies in terms of what they're putting into water and air and the toxicity of those chemicals times the weight that they're putting in. And it was really interesting. One of the forestry companies we uncovered was called Abitibi at the time. It was the biggest toxic water polluter in Canada. And when the story came out, I guess it got to their board of directors. They got it in the Globe and Mail. It became an agenda item at the board meeting, and they allocated $150 million to do the retrofit that they needed to do to stop the toxic water pollution at their pulp and paper plant. And so those things happen, and I think it's useful to focus on who's not doing well. And we've done divestment rankings to show which foundations and which pension funds are losing the most money from not getting out of fossil fuels. And that, of course, for the last couple of years hasn't been the theme, just given the geopolitical situation. But we looked at BlackRock, for example, over a 10-year period leading up into 2021. By staying invested in fossil fuels, it's opposed to taking the money out of fossil fuels just in their equity portfolio and spreading it to all the other stocks they own, the Googles, the Microsofts. They had $1 trillion of extra returns that they missed out on as a result of staying invested. And of course, there's we can unpack that and peel that onion back a bit. But sometimes when you focus on the losses or the bad things, it can drive a bit of a reconsideration. But our main focus is trying to find where the good magic is happening and to shine a light on it. And increasingly, the solutions in the economy are growing faster than the problems. And so if that trend continues, the problems kind of dwindle in relevance, but we do need to keep an eye on them for sure, because they're still big problems.
We've been talking with Toby Heaps, founder, publisher, CEO of Corporate Knights out of Canada. Let's go specific, Toby. Let's talk about 3 companies, each one a little different. Interface Corporation, Apple Corporation, and NVIDIA. Interface Corporation, to my knowledge, is the first company It's based out of Atlanta, and it's the leading manufacturer of carpet tiles in the world, with plants in the U.S. and around the world. It's the first company that declared that it went carbon neutral in 2019, based very much on the leadership of Ray Anderson, an engineer who was its founder and CEO until he passed away a few years ago. What do you think of that? Is that in your ranking at all, the Interface Corporation out of Atlanta, Georgia?
Yeah, well, Interface, first of all, really inspiring company. Ray Anderson was almost the spiritual leader in the corporate movement, and we all miss him a great deal. He set new standards, new cultural standards and new norms, I think, for many business leaders to think about their role as citizens, not just as stewards for the financial shareholders. And I hope that will be his legacy. And it's been interesting to see Interface continue to be a great leader. They've been just a little bit too small, but they have crossed the $1 billion annual revenue threshold. And so we do reach out and measure them. And I'm hoping this year, I know we've been paying kind of close attention. I remember talking with Ray about this when we first started the ranking. He's like, we're going to get big enough so we can make the ranking. And now they're big enough. So I hope that when the ranking results are finished this year, that the numbers check out and we have Interface in there. But they make this beautiful tile carpet. We have it all in Corporate Knight's office. You can sleep on it. It's from the circular economy. They recycle it. It's really functional. Great people work there. They really treat their people. It's not just a sort of token top-down thing. And, you know, that spear in the heart that he got when he read Paul Hawkins' book, it just really shows the spiritual transformation and the possibility for change just when a single leader gets something. But I think the big problem with Ray Anderson and Interface, specifically Ray Anderson, is there was only one Ray Anderson. And I hope that many more will be spawned, and we'll see the ripples and the waves over the coming years from the initial sort of strokes that he made.
A fitting tribute to Ray Anderson, and part of his legacy are 3 wonderful books that he's written. And he also made hundreds of speeches all over the country and the world showing what could be done. He just reconverted his whole company after he heard Paul Hawkins speak and read Paul Hawkins' book, as you pointed out. So he does have a legacy as well. And the second one is Apple, which certainly is big enough for your stipulation. What do you do with Apple, which doesn't have many polluting plants in the U.S., for example, but the pollution is in China, where they have 1 million workers under a Taiwanese company contracted to put out their computers and iPhones, and there have been horrific stories of the bad treatment of these workers and how the company has nets on the 5th and 8th floors or so of the factory to catch people who are so down and out that they try to commit suicide.
Yeah, the worker situation in those pressure cooker factories, you know, trying to deliver, especially in Christmas rushes, is really worrying. And we do monitor, we look at severe human rights violations, and we look at worker rights violations, we look at fatalities, and we look at injuries. And Apple does pretty good on the fatalities and injuries. It's normalized by number of workers, and you can imagine they have a large workforce, so there's still people dying. And, you know, some people think one person dying is too many, and every life matters a lot. We do use the Norwegian Sovereign Pension Fund, which has an amazing research resource where they go in minute detail analyze the legitimately severe human rights and worker rights violations that companies make. And they have a committee that goes and they do visits and due diligence, and they make this all publicly available. And when they decide a company has crossed that red line, it's not all companies, it has to be a pretty severe, egregious behavior or misconduct. They'll then put it on the sort of no-go list, and they'll publish it on their website. The acronym is NBIM, but it's the Norway Sovereign Wealth Fund. And so we use that, and Apple is not currently on that. They do have many controversies. They're not disqualified from the get-go. And what's been really interesting with Apple to see them, you know, it's a multi-trillion-dollar company, you know, I think it's the largest company in the world right now by market value. What's really interesting to look at Apple is they've had the environment on their agenda. As you know, Al Gore has been on their board, longest serving director for 20 years, been hammering that down. But more recently, after they acquired Lisa Jackson as their chief sustainability officer, they started to get a lot more serious about the materials that go into their phone. Is the aluminum coming from China, coal, or is it coming from renewable sources with new processes from Quebec? The latter is true now. And they've really tried to drill down into the real impacts that they make, you know, in terms of the resources that go into the phone and the energy efficiency of the phone and the recyclability of the phone. I would argue they have much work to do on the right to repair still, but they've made great progress. And compared to other manufactured devices, when you look at the various standards that their phones hit, they're leading edge, and the refurbishment business they have is in full swing, a significant piece of their overall business. And so on that piece, they're doing pretty good. On their supply chain, they're doing well. On the environmental piece, I'd say, as you pointed out, there's progress and a lot of challenges on the social and the worker piece that come with working in those countries for sure. But most interesting for me is when you look at a company like Apple or HP, about 98% of its environmental impact comes through its supply chain. It's not necessarily, it's the emissions from the aluminum. It's not their how much electricity they're using at their headquarters in California. But where even more impact comes is what they do with their political power. Companies like Apple and Google Alphabet, they are so powerful in Washington, D.C., and Brussels, around the world. They have armies of government relations folks. They employ, sometimes in the case of Facebook, ex-deputy prime ministers as their chief lobbyists, and they have such power. And traditionally, they've been focused on things like antitrust and various digital issues. But increasingly, because they recognize that it's both a huge issue for their employees, and Bill Wheel has done tremendous work with Climate Voices, California, really kind of harnessing the power of the employees of these companies who want climate and want bold climate action and climate policy. And these companies have such political power that if they just put their finger on the scale, sometimes it's enough to get something like the Inflation Reduction Act, which had a lot of flaws, but also had a lot of good things in there, get that thing through that was hanging in the cusp and for a while didn't look like it was going anywhere. And so now Apple and Google have both started to, in a concerted way, use their corporate power to advance bolder climate policy. And it's an essential counterweight, through lobbies like the Chamber, which traditionally are captured by the narrow rump of fossil fuel interests. And they misrepresent the voice of business and advocate for laggard policies that try and hold back the growth of the clean energy economy. And now you have companies like Apple, who on many instances, both in public and in private, are now putting their finger on the scale to get bolder clean energy policies. I was at a meeting I was hosting in New York this week on Monday, and there were representatives from all these companies there at a quite senior level discussing what they're doing. Not all of it there is all in the public. Some of it can be traced and stuff. But it's really interesting to see these nonprofits like Influence Map, which tracks how corporate power is used to influence climate policy and how major industry associations can distort that. They have a ranking of the leaders on this. They also rate the laggards, who gets an F all the way to A to F. It's really, really great outfit, sort of like halfway between J. Edgar Hoover and Santa Claus on climate lobbying.
But Toby, they're still responsible for a million serf-like workers in China under their contractor. And how do you crank that in?
Yeah, the worker issue is a big issue. So, we do look at their injury rates, the lost time incidents, which are, self-reported. And we do look at the fatalities per full-time equivalent employee. And they do come out strong on both those metrics when you normalize it by the number of employees. But there are issues. And we do look at the major controversies. And if Apple was to be put on the no-go zone by the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, then they would be ineligible for our ranking. So that's always something that they're managing, and it is a tension. Amazon, for example, they've crossed the red line from their various worker practices and are on the no-go zone. And so they're not eligible for our rankings. Apple has problems, similar magnitude, but not quite at the pitch that Amazon has. And so
what about the pay of the workers?
The pay of the workers is, one of the main metrics we look at, which is considered quite controversial by companies, is we look at the CEO to average worker pay. So we're looking at all of their employees, what the average pay is of all their employees around the world, and then looking at that as a ratio to the CEO. And the CEO, Tim Cook is getting a fairly handsome paycheck. We're looking at the options, the full value, the compensation, remuneration for the CEO. And the higher that ratio, the CEO to average worker ratio is, the lower the score of the company. And within Apple's sector, there's a fairly high weight on that indicator because there is a worrying sort of spread between the executive to worker pay ratios. So that's something that we take into account, and the company gets penalized when they have a high CEO to average worker pay.
A year ago, Tim Cook was being paid $833 a minute on a 40-hour week, not counting benefits. And their charitable giving as a percent is one of the lowest of any major corporation in the United States. You crank in, their charitable giving is about 0.2%. And under federal tax law, they can give up to 10% of their adjusted gross and deduct it. Do you crank in the charitable giving issue?
No, we intentionally excluded charitable giving from the get-go, and not that there's anything wrong with it, but traditionally the idea of corporate citizenship, corporate sustainability was conflated with this sort of how much money are you giving to charity? And our whole thrust has always been, what are you doing with your core business? How are you impacting the world with your core product and service? Are you paying your taxes? Are you paying your workers? And we really, kind of shied away. Some companies do give as much as 1% of their pre-tax profits. Apple is at the far low end of that. but it's not we put weight on what percentage of their profits is paid in cash tax over a 5-year period. We look at that and put a lot more emphasis.
And how do you get data on something like this, which Samsung has chided Apple, the recycling of their products when they're disposed, iPhones and computers, and they're taken apart by workers, and it's a very toxic work exposure. How do you deal with that when there's virtually no data on that?
Yeah, it's tough. Like, we can't see everything that's going on. Increasingly, there's, we use millions of data points that we believe to be credible. We partner with over 24, mostly nonprofits that have specific expertise on monitoring different of these issues that we look at, who come up with the dark red flag companies, whether it's deforestation that's being done through satellite and looking at where the goods are going through the supply chain so we can tackle them. But some of these issues, we rely on the dark red flag. So we're looking for this to kind of rise to the level where it becomes significant, almost indictment, where the company can be put on the hit list. We do also track 122 different sources of fines, penalties, and settlements from different jurisdictions, whether it's OSHA in the US or EPA or equivalents around the world. And we have this really amazing, actually, researcher that's based out of Missouri. He spends about half his life putting this all together and updating it every day. Russell Mulcahy, I think, first discovered him. That's how I discovered him. And we use that now. We're the main user of his data, and we employ him to collect this data. And so we know when a company's fines, penalties, and settlements reaches 1% of their revenue, they're put on the hit list, and they can no longer be eligible for the ranking. And then we also deduct up to 5% of their total score, depending on how the ratio of their fines, penalties, and settlements ranks relative to their peers. And so that's something that becomes real. As you know, there's lots of stories out there. A big company is going to have all sorts of smear stories. Some of them are going to have truth. Some of them are not going to. And we don't want to just be doing a beauty contest or subject to the latest headline. We're trying to do something that's reasonably rooted in evidence, and it can be defensible and can be considered fair. And we recognize that none of the big companies that we rank are perfect. They all have major issues, which is kind of the nature of the human condition.
Yeah, needless to say, how do the companies react to you? Do they say, ouch? Do they complain if they're not on the list, the way universities complain to U.S. News and World Report when they are down in the rankings, or the way companies complain to Consumer Reports when they get a negative assessment of their product? What kind of feedback are you getting? Or are they trying to ignore you? And when you do rank them high, we're talking with Toby Heaps, the founder and publisher of Corporate Knights out of Canada. When they do get a high ranking, do they publicize it in their advertising? And does that worry you at all?
I'm sure. I love this question. So they don't ignore us, which is the main thing. We get a lot of flack, and then companies do try to make hay. The ones who make the rankings, most of them do try to make major hay out of it. And many of them are able to, and we're always conscious and watching because, of course, there's reputational risks for us when someone has our imprinter. So let's start with Lockheed Martin. We have many companies that are upset with us because they feel like they're not getting the high scores they deserve. We have a completely transparent, 100% transparent, rules-based process that anybody can download. It's good evening reading. Don't read it lying down if you want to finish it, but it's in excruciating detail. Lockheed Martin was really upset. They felt that we were not counting their sales of weapons as sustainable, and it was a huge error because they're keeping the free world safe from authoritarian regimes, and we should be counting the sales of their weapons as good for society. And they wrote, I can share it with you by email. I can't believe they put it in writing. It's really quite funny from a senior executive. We have companies like from the forestry industry that are not doing sustainable forestry practices. They have some sort of relatively weak industry certification that's not endorsed by environmental groups, and we don't count their revenue from forest products, and they get really, really upset at us. On the other side, we now see that many companies really appreciate the attention to detail that we have gone through, the practical attention to detail that we've gone to in making up this taxonomy, a classification system for what is sustainable in terms of a business activity and what is not in terms of a product, because it gets pretty into the minutiae. What kind of a printer is sustainable? What kind of a dishwasher is sustainable? What kind of a building? It gets into a lot of minutiae, and we've made it quite practical and clear what's in and what's out. Now we have major companies, many $100 billion plus market value companies that use our taxonomy as part of their formal audited accounting procedure to track how much of their revenues are sustainable, because it's sort of an integrated taxonomy. And we've noticed that this has been really encouraging to see companies like McCormick or Schneider Electric who ranked quite highly, number one in the industry or number one overall in the world in the case of Schneider Electric several years ago. They use this as a sort of badge of trust. And when they're going around to these large institutional investors, pension funds, BlackRocks, who all have conviction portfolios where they go overweight into companies that they believe are on the right side of history and various economic trends. And many of them believe that these sustainability trends are powerful predictors of who's going to win economically. And so when they have this Corporate Knights imprinter, they know that this is legit. This isn't one of these greenwash things that's for sale. Our rankings are not for sale. Everything's 100% transparent. We've been doing it for 20 years. And it helps them raise money. In many cases, they shift their shareholder base from 5 or 10% sustainable investors to 50 to 60% sustainable investors. And I've heard this from a number of companies, and that gives them the leeway to pursue more long-term visions and not be a subject to sort of raiders and the myopic focus on quarterly short-term profits. So it's been really nice to see that. And we hope that that just becomes a sort of more powerful feedback mechanism as we push forward.
What is the special offer you have for our listeners regarding getting copies of Corporate Knights?
Sure. If anybody would like to get 4 free download copies, digital of the last 4 issues of Corporate Knights, you can go to corporateknights.com. That's Knights with a K, it's plural, corporateknights.com/Ralph Nader. And then the password is Justice, all caps, all capital. And then you'll get links to the 4 last issues that we've done. And also if you want a discount link of half price to subscribe to our publication going forward.
And that password again, slowly?
Justice, just JUSTICE, all caps.
Pretty good word. Thank you very much. We've been speaking with Toby Heaps, the founder and publisher of Corporate Knights out of Canada with a global range. And we look forward to the fulfillment of your remaining 98% of your expectations, Toby. Good luck.
Thanks, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Toby Heaps. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. And we've arranged a special deal with Corporate Knights for our listeners. You can go to corporateknights.com/Ralph Nader and use the discount code JUSTICE for a 100% discount on the last 4 digital issues. Those who redeem the code will also receive an offer for a discounted print subscription. It's all set up already, so feel free to use it if you'd like to check out the magazine. And as we all know, 100% discount means free. Up next, we welcome back Dr. Bandy Lee to discuss the Republican Party's favorite malignant narcissist. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, September 22, 2023. I'm Russell Mokhiber. A regulator in France has asked that Apple stop selling its iPhone 12 there after it said tests found that the device emits radiation levels exceeding European standards. Apple disputed the findings, saying the device, released in 2020, has been certified by international bodies and complies with regulations, the AP reported. The French regulatory agency said in a statement that it expects Apple to deploy all available means to put an end to the non-compliance and that failure to act could result in a product recall. Joel Moskowitz, director of the Center for Family and Community Health at the University of California, Berkeley, pointed to a 2020 meta-analysis that suggested that using cell phones for a cumulative call time of more than 1,000 hours was associated with an increased risk of tumors. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with Hannah Feldman and Ralph. Why is 30% of the country still in love with Donald Trump? Let's ask a doctor. Hannah?
Dr. Bandy Lee is a medical doctor, a forensic psychiatrist, and a world expert on violence who taught at Yale School of Medicine and Yale Law School for 17 years before transferring recently to Columbia and Harvard. She is currently president of the World Mental Health Coalition, an educational organization that assembles mental health experts to collaborate with other disciplines for the betterment of public mental health and public safety. She is the editor of The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, 37 Psychiatrists and Mental Health Experts Assess a President, and Profile of a Nation, Trump's Mind, America's Soul. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. Bandy Lee.
Thank you very much for having me back.
Yeah, welcome back, Bandy. I've always been astonished at the harsh criticism you've received from some members of your own profession, even though many members supported your position in your description of Trump's behavior, character, personality, performance, and the retaliatory nature of Yale University, which basically pushed you out where you had been teaching and working for so many years. The reason why I'm puzzled is because many editorial writers, columnists, book writers have said the same thing, but not in psychological or psychiatric language. I mean, Mark Green and I had a withering criticism of Trump on many fronts in our book, Wrecking America, that came out in 2020, exclusively on Donald J. Trump. And so I'd like to open this discussion by referring to a magazine article on you in Mother Jones' September-October 2022 issue, which is subtitled, "The Psychiatrist Who Warned Us That Donald Trump Would Unleash Violence Was Absolutely Right," and it's called "The Vindication of Bandy Lee." Could you describe what that vindication entailed?
Good to talk with you again, Ralph. The article was referring to what happened with the January 6th Capitol attack and then the hearings that came afterward. I guess that was the timing of the article. But of course, we've been warning against the dangers that Donald Trump would bring since the publication of The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. And that's precisely why many of us academics and clinicians who had not spoken publicly before decided that it was our duty, both professional and civic, to speak about the dangers that we saw. And at the same time, we did predict that the most important voices would be silenced in a time of authoritarianism, which was the direction we were going with the kinds of mental impairments in a leader that we have had in Donald Trump. If we did not contain him early enough, then what results is authoritarianism or fascism. What is most dismaying is that with all the tools that we had and all the support that we had, you mentioned attacks from within the field. Well, that's what the public is seeing, but there was a medical consensus when we first came out, which was the reason for putting out a book, and thousands of mental health professionals joined us in the World Mental Health Coalition, and over 50 members of Congress met with us, agreeing that our voice in the mental health profession was important. So even though we were saying the same thing as the general public, it, in a sense, couldn't just be dismissed as a political opinion or an insult or simple musings of someone who hasn't dealt with this kind of situation day in and day out, albeit in smaller scale.
You know, what's amazing about this is that the press, after your best-selling book came out on Donald Trump, started scaling down coverage until they basically blacked you and your colleagues out. At the same time that there were op-eds in these same newspapers tearing into Trump like the Lincoln Project and other syndicated columnists, and it was okay with the publishers and editors. And I think part of it has to do with the language used. The minute you use psychiatric language, you know, they start comparing the situation with dissidents in the Soviet Union and how they were described instead of dissident citizens, disloyal to the regime and punished accordingly. But I published an op-ed in the Boston Globe trying to figure out why a chronic hourly liar who created totally false realities about his own record, his own performance in the business world and the political world, about what was going on in the world. I mean, total made-up fantasies. A president who, in his career, cheated people, lied about people, defamed people. And I'm asking the question, why do so many people support him? You got about 30% of the voting public still with him, no matter what the indictments are, the content of the indictments, his continuing lying about the election, saying he won in a landslide, never mind close. So he won in a landslide in 2020. And so in this Boston Globe article, I had a composite, still loyal Trump voter. It was written with a light touch. But the voter needs to be analyzed by everybody, the voters for Trump, because without them, Trump would be a castaway. So I had 12 reasons that this composite loyal Trump voter gave to support Trump. The first one is and I'm quoting this composite voter, quote, "I have few expectations of politicians, and Trump means those I really care about. He's against abortion and gun control, selects conservative judges, favors a strong defense, and loves this country." So that's their expectation level. The second one was, he wants to make America great again and make America build again in America. Who can disagree with that wonderful patriotic wish? The third one is, oh, he brags all the time about himself and his businesses. That's because he believes in himself, no matter what happens to his sometimes failing companies. Believing in oneself is what my parents always taught me. To have someone believe so much in himself on national TV gives me the confidence that I need to believe in myself, end quote. And one is, quote, "Sure, he fibs a lot, like a lot of people, but he fibs optimistically against the dismal truth. He gives me hope that way," end quote. And on and on. So what do you think of analyzing the 30% of the voters who have no marker when it comes to Trump? He can violate all kinds of criminal laws, as he did, the Anti-Deficiency Act, the Hatch Act. He can violate the Constitution and say in public, quote, "With Article 2, I can do whatever I want as president," end quote. I've had constitutional law people say that itself is an impeachable offense. That's the declaration of a dictator. And they're still with him. Now, they would never support a friend or a neighbor who lied all the time, who had power over them, who described things that weren't real about what was going on around them or what he did in the past, who cheated his workers. They would never support. So what is this dichotomy? And where is the psychology and psychiatric profession on this?
Well, I can tell you what the psychiatric profession has said since Donald Trump. Precisely, it was Jeffrey Lieberman of Columbia, past president of the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, who was the one who said that those who were speaking up were imitating Soviet psychiatry. Of course, the converse would be true, and that those who are trying to speak the truth in a time of gaslighting and misleading and downright psychological manipulation, that speaking the truth in these times would allow people to free their minds. So one side effect that silencing mental health professionals has had is that people have not been able to understand the difference between informed, rational decision-making versus a product of manipulation. In fact, having their entire freedom and personality be taken away. We know that Donald Trump is not capable of rational thinking. We actually had a panel do a mental capacity assessment of him, and that's an examination that is important because it relates to harm to the public. And so we did it on request of many members of the public. It doesn't require a personal interview. In fact, we tried to request one and got no response. So we proceeded and had enough information, actually from the Mueller report, collateral reports by people who worked with him and knew him, that essentially he did not have the capacity to have ideologies or policies. He can't think at that level. What he can do is to manipulate psychologically those who are vulnerably predisposed and those who have formed emotional bonds with him, to have them attach themselves to him regardless of his violations of whatever he promised in the past, despite his far from being the president for the forgotten man and forgotten woman. He's the president who has crushed the forgotten man and forgotten woman. That does not matter because he has led them to a place that is outside of reality. And this speaks to the power of the mind. The mind is flexible. It can even mold itself in ways to accept all kinds of conditions. That is why we've had Trump supporters who were going to their deathbeds from COVID and insisting that it was not COVID. It could not be because it was something that was made up to undermine his political campaign. So these are the kinds of effects that we expect from having a person with severe mental symptoms, holding an influential position, and having lots of public exposure. We do have a propagation of symptoms. Now, I've been calling this the Trump contagion, but what it really is shared psychosis, which is a psychosocial phenomenon that's been researched and described since around the mid-19th century. And exactly what I said happens in this situation when someone with severe mental symptoms goes untreated, holds an influential position, be it in a couple's relationship, in a family or a group or a nation. It's the same dynamic. The symptoms will spread. It's not the healthy person who makes the ill person better, but rather the ill person who spreads symptoms to the point where those who were previously healthy didn't have the symptoms come to look as if they have the primary illness.
Bandy Lee, people are trying to understand the Trump voters. So they have legitimate grievances. They've been shut out by the two parties. Wages are frozen. They have trouble getting health insurance. They are not given voice on the media, even the public media. They see public services crumbling around them. They see themselves ridiculed on fictional TV programs as, sort of dolts or bumbling people. And Trump comes along, and in one expression by a Ohio steelworker who moved to Georgia, and he was asked by a reporter, why is he supporting Trump? And he said, they say Trump is crazy, but he's saying what I'm thinking. Does that mean I'm crazy? That's a very insightful comment. And of course, he's beat up on the media, and they love that. And they love the fact the media keeps publicizing him because they want to get great ratings, and they think he's pretty clever, that he's beating up on the media and getting more media as a result, which isn't exactly the experience of most people. And then, of course, he brags about his riches much more than he's actually rich, and that gets people to say, well, that means he can't be bought. Nobody's going to buy him. He's got his own planes and mansions, etc. And then, of course, there's this fear of immigration that he stoked, taking away jobs from people and getting social service supports for the immigrants. So, there's a lot there, and I think part of it is no small part is the default of the Democratic Party. They lost the connection with the blue-collar workers. Limbaugh took over, and Reagan developed the Reagan blue-collar worker crew, and the Democrats started going into the cultural issues and the word police back and forth, and they didn't push like FDR and Truman and others for higher minimum wages and full Medicare for all the things that count for people regardless of their political ideologies, down where they live, work, and raise their families, where the abstract ideological manipulations are not quite as pertinent. They're really looking at the daily chores and pressures of life and trying to survive them. So I think a lot of work needs to be done in understanding these people and not simply putting them in a typology and a stereotype under the penumbra of Donald J. Trump.
Yes, of course. It's during times of crisis and deprivation or vast socioeconomic inequality where one becomes psychologically wounded to the point of being vulnerable to, one may call them demagogues, but they're equally developmentally wounded individuals, such as Donald Trump. He happened to be the one who appeared at the time, but there are any number of such individuals in different societies, different historical times. In the psychiatric setting, we see them, it's a certain percentage, 5 to 10% of developmentally wounded individuals who, well, what's important is that we do not place them in positions of power. That is where the danger was and the exceptional dynamic was. It's not that an Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin is so rare in human history. Rather, they're quite common. But it's rare that they are elevated to positions of power. And that is what happened here. And that's why I feel that all these legitimate grievances, true conditions in society that need fixing, were, instead of being fixed, exploited and psychologically exploited for political advantage. And I believe that is truly what is behind our inability to intervene with an obviously impaired president, or our inability to keep him from getting to the presidency in the first place.
We've been talking with Dr. Bandy Lee, formerly of Yale University, who tried to, with her colleagues, raise the highlight on Donald Trump's unstable behavior, to put it euphemistically, and continues to do so, and is constantly reinforced and supported by the daily behavior of Donald J. Trump. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nader.
We've been speaking with Dr. Bandy Lee. We will link to her work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. That's our show. I want to thank our guests again, Toby Heaps and Dr. Bandy Lee. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to cut out now, but for you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis, and in case you haven't heard, a transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel, and for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
We have a new issue of the Capitol Hill Citizen out now. To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember, to continue the conversation after each show, go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode. We read them all.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreaders, Elizabeth Solomon. Our indefatigable associate producer is Hannah Feldman. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Our guest will be journalist and author Stephen Kinzer. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Remember, try to become a Capitol citizen. Good way. Go to capitalcitizen.com and order a copy of this special newspaper focusing on Congress in ways the mainstream press does not.
Rise up and take over power. Stand up, stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, stand up. Step up. You ought to step up. Rise up, rise up. I know you ought to rise